Hello and welcome. This is video number 2 in an 8-part series on World War I. And in today's video, we're going to take a look at the part of Europe, the Balkans region, and then the actual event that will put World War I in motion, which is the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. So hopefully you'll find this video informative and helpful. Let's get started. Now, what we're ready to talk about now is a region in Europe known as the Balkans. The Balkans would be a significant point for the start of World War I. Now, if you're not familiar with where in Europe the Balkans is, it's basically southeastern Europe. Now, if you look at the picture that's on the screen right now, you can see a little bit where Greece is at and where Italy's at, which you might be a little more familiar with those locations. And you can see the area where Serbia is noted. That's basically right in the middle of the region known as the Balkans. Now, some of the reasons why this was an important place at this time. We've talked before about the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire, at its greatest extent, did go on into present-day Europe, up to where Austria is at today. And at the point we're talking about now, which is into the early 1900s, the Ottoman Empire had been declining for some time and had basically pulled mostly out of what we think of as Europe today. And one of the things that was a big deal about that is people who were living in southeastern Europe, an area that at one point had been controlled by the Ottoman Empire, now had a different kind of opportunity for freedom. And part of what made that a big deal is that there were a lot of different types of people that lived in the region. And so as these people felt they had an opportunity for freedom that they hadn't had before, one of the things that they would desire would be to have their own country, a place that they could identify with as their own. So one of the things we see in this region, especially at this time, are strong feelings of nationalism. The picture that's showing right now is a more modern look at the countries of the Balkans region. But what I want you to notice are the different colors that are in the map. Those different colors represent different ethnic groups in that region. And so the main thing I want you to see is that that was an area that had a lot of different types of people, all living in fairly close proximity to one another. You can see that in some cases, they're a pretty cohesive group, but you can see in other cases there's a lot of blending and mixing, especially with people, especially with the Serbian people in particular. So if we go back to the time, though, of the early 1900s, with some of this freedom, you saw a lot of border changes taking place, which, though that was desired by a lot of people, different groups of people didn't always agree on where those borders ought to be. And that was a challenge just among the people in that specific region themselves. Something else that was also a challenge is that bigger countries like Austria-Hungary, like Russia, had their own interests in the region. And when you mixed the people living in the region that wanted their own little place with these bigger countries that had their own interests, created a volatile environment, a challenging set of circumstances. And so on this last slide for the Balkans at this point, the concern that the big countries had really would become important. Just want to speak briefly back to the alliances we talked about yesterday. You can see on this map, it shows where the Triple Entente and Triple Alliance countries were. If you look in the bottom right-hand corner, you can see where it's got places like Serbia and Romania and Bulgaria listed. That's the Balkans region, and especially when you look at the proximity of Austria-Hungary and Russia to that, you can see why those would be two countries that would definitely have an interest in what was going on there. Now, the next thing I want to speak to is the actual event that started in World War I. Now, there is a video that will go into pretty great detail on this event, and so I'm going to be pretty brief in what I say about it. But this is definitely an important area of the topic of World War I to be familiar with. So just going through it briefly, that indicates the video you should watch. Just going through it briefly, some key points. First of all, there's an assassination. The person who ends up being assassinated is a man named Franz Ferdinand. He was the person who was next in line to be the leader for the country of Austria-Hungary. So he was not the top leader, but definitely a significant person. I suppose in some respects you could kind of think of it as being equivalent to in our country if the vice president were to be assassinated. It wouldn't be the president, but it would be somebody very close and very high up in the leadership scale. Now, timing, June 28th, 1914. Usually don't get too much into dates, but this is definitely an important date. And I also want you to be familiar with the timeline of events as they unfolded, because especially on the front end of World War I, things happened pretty quickly. So June 28th, 1914 is when the assassination took place. The location where it took place was in the city of Sarajevo, that was at the time in the Bosnian region. And that was an area of interest for Austria-Hungary. The reason they were there was just to make what they would refer to as a state visit. And that was something that was well known, and that was part of what would play into the opportunity for an assassination. The people that would carry it out knew well in advance that Franz Ferdinand would be in that city. And again, the video will go into more detail on just how that all played out. Now, just to touch on who was responsible for it, if you want to isolate a single person, Gavrilo Princip, the person who is pictured there, was the person who actually pulled the trigger. The way it took place, it was shooting Franz Ferdinand at very close to him with a gun. But Gavrilo Princip was not alone. He was a part of what we'd probably today call a terrorist organization that was called the Black Hand. Now, this was a group that operated out of Serbia and was interested in expanding the scope and reach of Serbs and Serbia itself, but it was not a part of the Serbian government, and that'll be an important distinction coming up. So this was a group that was operating independent and on its own, and some people refer to them as a secret society that was basically working to promote Serbian interests in Bosnia and trying to limit and get rid of Austrian influence.